Hello. We're going to do something a little bit different with the podcast today, which is that we actually have video from this particular podcast interview. It's something I was curious about trying for a little bit, and it just kind of worked out this time around. So welcome to the video version of Opinion Science Podcast. You can obviously find other episodes of the podcast on YouTube, but it's just the audio file with some waveform animations on it. But here you get to actually see the conversation take place. Do note, though, that I didn't quite have mastered the situation with video, and you can see me sort of looking in this direction for most of the time because that's where Chris was in my field of view. So he had a nice setup. He was looking straight on into the camera, but I'm going to be looking down into the corner. But you'll get over it pretty quick. If you listen to the podcast on the normal podcast feed, you'll hear this episode open up with a snappy little description of an important study that sets the stage. Rather than try to reproduce all of that here, I'm just going to give you kind of a free-form summary of what that study is. And it has to do with the notion of bots online. There are all sorts of bots online. They're just kind of like little mini software programs that make tasks easier, right? So search engines have bots that crawl through the internet and collect up new websites to index into the search engine algorithms. Spam bots clog up your inbox and the comment sections of YouTube videos, in addition to other comment sections. But one kind of bot is a social bot. These are social media accounts that are not run by people, human beings, but are instead automated programs that post certain kinds of things. And so some researchers wanted to know whether these kinds of bots might have any impact on political polarization. Polarized attitudes are no surprise to anyone living in the modern world. We talk about them all the time. And there's increasing partisan polarization, particularly in the US, and I'm sure other places as well, where liberals are increasingly antagonistic toward conservatives increasingly hostile toward liberals in their attitudes and feelings. And, maybe part of the reason why is because people are insulated in a political bubble. Liberals only are really being exposed to liberal ideas, and so those feel more correct. And conservatives similarly are only being exposed to conservative ideas, and so those feel more correct. And so if we could break those bubbles, would we make change? Could we soften this kind of polarization as we come to see one another as just other people living in the world that have maybe differences of opinion, but natural differences of opinion? So some researchers programmed some Twitter bots that were just social media accounts, Twitter accounts that would randomly retweet messages from prominent liberal figures on Twitter or prominent conservative figures on Twitter. And they recruited a whole bunch of ordinary, everyday American people to follow one of these social media accounts. Liberal participants in this study were assigned to follow a bot that would retweet conservative ideas, and conservatives would follow a Twitter bot that would retweet liberal ideas, effectively breaking people out of their political bubbles. So that went on over a certain course of time. And then at the end, everyone was surveyed. Now, they didn't know the survey had anything to do with this Twitter experiment. The Twitter thing in the heads of the participants was a totally separate activity or research study that they were being put in, and they didn't even really know that it was a political study. No mention was made of politics for the first couple of days. These bots just retweeted a bunch of pictures of nature. So there was no indication that they were in a political study. And the survey they got seemed like it was coming from some other source. So in the minds of people, they were effectively separated. But when they answered that survey, liberals and conservatives who had been following bots that retweeted messages from outside of their political bubbles, did they have any differences in the strength of their own ideologies compared to a random sample of folks who did not follow any of these Twitter accounts? Well, they found that this experiment didn't work in quite the way that you might have thought. In fact, what happened instead was that people became more entrenched in the views they already had when they were being exposed to information outside of their bubble. So conservative participants who had been following a Twitter bot that retweeted liberal ideas became significantly more conservative at the end of the study. And the conservative folks who paid the most attention to what the bots were retweeting were the ones who became the most conservative, or who became more conservative to a greater degree, right? Meaning that breaking outside of their bubble was actually creating more polarization. Now, the same was basically true of liberals, although it wasn't statistically significant. Liberal participants who followed a conservative bot did become somewhat more liberal in their views, just not significantly so, but they sure as heck did not become any less liberal, which is what the grand experiment might have been aiming for. So, together, these studies paint an interesting picture of how social media creates bubbles. When we try to break out of them, do they exacerbate or ameliorate the problem? And here we have some evidence that it actually created more polarization. So today on Opinion Science, I talked to Dr. Chris Bail, who's a professor of sociology at Duke University. He runs the Polarization Lab, and he recently came out with a book. Actually, I have it here. This is the beauty of the video version, Breaking the Social Media Prism, How to Make Our Platforms Less Polarizing, which is a great read. So I talked to Chris about the book, about his Twitter experiment. If I didn't mention it, Chris is the guy who sort of spearheaded that Twitter experiment I just described. And he writes about new research, new data, evidence from political science, sociology, psychology, and some intriguing insights about what our platforms, our social media platforms, are doing that are actually creating polarization, or at least preventing us from getting over that hump. So I invite you now to not only listen, but watch my conversation with Dr. Chris Bail about social media and political polarization. So we'll cut to that now. So I thought one place to start is, I think you might be the first true sociologist that I've talked to for this show. And I'm curious if you could do a little breakdown. In the book, you mention, you define sociology. And as I read it, I thought, gosh, that sounds a heck of a lot like social psychology, which is my bread and butter. So I wondered if you could just even paint a picture of what sociology is. Like, what are the assumptions that make you a sociologist instead of some other kind of social scientist? And then also, what is the computational part of it? Because that seems pretty central to your academic identity.
Yeah. I mean, sociology, I define sociology as the science of social relationships. And that's a little bit distinct from social psychology. Certainly, social psychology is shaped by social relationships. But for sociologists, there's a kind of geometry to social relations. We tend to do things like map social networks, or think about how large groups of people interacting with each other create kind of systems level phenomenon. So where, we think of a lot of human behavior as emergent, meaning like, what happens at one time and the characteristics of people at one time can't necessarily be used to predict the outcomes at another time. And so, one thing that I think is unique about sociology is we capture some of the complexity of social relationships, especially as they unfold over time. And, ironically, I think social psychology, if we go way back, grew out of, a lot of classical sociology. So the first mention of social psychology that I've ever been able to find in the canon is the work of Norbert Elias, a very long lost, founding figure in sociology, who really thought that, what we really need is a kind of collective psychology, in kind of contradistinction to the then prominent, Freudian stuff going on.
And so where does the computational part come into it? So sociologists, sociology 50 years ago looks different than the work that you're doing.
Absolutely.
Because of the tools that were available.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways it's funny, in the 1950s, the question on the tip of every sociologist's tongue, or a lot of them, was mass persuasion. So we were exiting World War II, and, and there's other parallels too, like, radio was really coming into a golden era. TV was, broadcasting was becoming so prominent. And there were actually a lot of questions about technology and mass persuasion that a lot of people were looking at in interesting ways. Of course, though, the last, half century kind of upended everything. In the social sciences, I think we often think of ourselves as kind of data poor. We don't have the particle accelerator and the colliders that physicists have, or the tightly controlled experiments that we might want to do a lot of the time. But on the other hand, the kind of explosion of data from not only from social media and the internet, but also from the mass digitization of human archives has really prompted some of us to say, especially, the great Duncan Watts, a really prominent sociologist, to say, social science has finally found its telescope. And I think by that, he means that, with all this data, we can finally start to unlock some of these population level processes that were once kind of largely impossible to study. So this new era that, a lot of us are calling computational social science really is trying to work towards some of those large scale questions using these new types of data sources. And also, of course, parallel advances in machine learning and computing power that enabled these kinds of new types of models.
Yeah, I like the idea of these new data stores being the opportunity for social scientists to finally go, aha, we've got a way to do some of this stuff that we've always dreamed of doing and thought we could try to do, and now we actually have a handle on it. And not to maybe jump into the limitations too early, but it can feel like this approach is like, finally, we can just solve all the problems that we've been thinking about. But what are some of the, like, even just thinking about them at this stage, like, what are some of the challenges that we still have to be a little bit cautious before we go all in on the conclusions we can draw from these data?
Oh, so there's so many. I mean, our telescope may be better described as like a crappy pair of binoculars right now, and this happens in any kind of paradigmatic shift in science. We reach the peak of expectations when, 5-6 years ago, people were talking about, for example, getting rid of public opinion surveys because, maybe Twitter data could be used to, take the pulse of the public, right? And one of the most obvious things in my research, and I've had a kind of circuitous path into computational social science, I've come out of a lot of qualitative work, actually in-depth interviewing work. And so one of the really fascinating things to me is to compare, use multiple methods to try to triangulate social science. And what we see very clearly there is this just stunningly huge gap between social media and real life in particular. And, if even though we might be tempted to say, use Twitter or, TikTok or whatever kind of, data we can scrounge together to make sense of human relationships, we're just seeing like a small part of it. And it turned out in my research that understanding that gap became probably the single most important explanation of social media and political polarization, which is what I'm currently studying.
Yeah, I want to get to the new interview stuff that you've been doing for the understanding these dynamics, but to sort of get that rolling, we kind of have to talk about what instigated all of that, which is this big study that attempted to break echo chambers. And so I'm curious where the impetus for this came from, like truly to think like, all we have to do is just show people the other side of the conversation and people are going to come around. Like, did it seem as obvious as I'm making it out to be at the time?
Well, I mean, we've known for 50 years that birds of a feather sing together, to use the kind of, axiom of social science identified by the sociologist Paul Lazarsfeld in the 1940s and 1950s, right? People, tend to surround themselves with like-minded people. And the concern, of course, translated into politics, is that this can create a kind of myopia, where we can't, see that there's two sides to every story, or we can't empathize with the other side, and so on and so forth. And, in 2017, when we launched the study that you were describing, it was a pretty tidy explanation of what had happened, right? Liberals were shocked that Trump got elected. People were shocked that Brexit happened in the UK, and the idea of an echo chamber that had insulated us from opposing views provided a really convenient explanation. It was just Facebook's fault. It was Twitter's fault. And, I was largely in, support of that view at the time, and had the hubris of many kind of data scientists of my generation and computational social scientists to say, well, we can just, dive into the Twitter data and figure this out. And so we quickly realized that, we could see patterns of echo chambers. Turns out there's a lot of questions about how big they are and how persistent they are, but we could see them. But what we couldn't know is whether people were kind of creating echo chambers around themselves, or whether the echo chambers were influencing their views. And so we're kind of trapped in some circular reasoning. We can see that, some people are talking the same way because they're surrounded by the same type of people. But what we'd really like to do is break them out of their echo chamber. We'd really like to see what happens, as you said, when you take someone outside their echo chamber. And, we did think that there was a good case that this would make people moderate. I mean, there's, several decades of social psychology going all the way back to at least Gordon Allport in the 1950s, would suggest that when you encounter someone from another group, especially in person, you learn that the prejudice or stereotypes you might have had about them aren't true. And then you kind of, you change your views. So that was a very, promising potential hypothesis. There was some indication at the time, though, too, of what are known as backfire effects, attempts to persuade people, actually making them double down in their pre-existing views. So we did have some inkling that the experiment might not go the way that so much social science and social psychology might have suggested.
So when you saw what the results were, to what extent did you go, yeah, there's that backfire effect, versus like, whoa, that's not what we thought was going to happen. Even if it was possible, I truly didn't think that was going to happen.
Yeah, it was certainly a bummer. I mean, because, had we found, that people moderated their views, then there's a simple solution, just dial up the exposure to, opposing groups. And at the time, this is something that Jack Dorsey told the Washington Post that he was thinking about doing. So we were really hoping for that. Whether, the extent to which we were surprised, I guess, the big question is, does social media create the kind of conditions necessary for reasonable and rational deliberation and mutual understanding? And, when you begin to think about it, Ezra Klein, when he wrote about our study, I think really nailed it. He said something like, think about the last time that you encountered someone with an opposing view online. Were you like calmly considering an alternative viewpoint, or were you really pissed that someone called Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez a communist? Or if you're on the other side, that, someone called Brett Kavanaugh a rapist, right? Like, these are the types of things that are, kind of typical on social media, expressions of identity, not really expressions of ideas. And so we want social media to be a competition of ideas, but really it's a competition of identities. And so, that's really the crux of it, I think.
So at what point did that then transition into the second wave of this work that is really what kind of centers and grounds the book project, which are these interviews? And I hadn't realized that kind of qualitative work was something that you had a background in. And so this is a more natural direction than I thought maybe it was. And so what was it about this that seemed like, the only way we can really get a grasp on this is to do that quantitative computational stuff again, but complement it with this kind of in-depth qualitative interviewing method?
I think, again, we social scientists are usually content to stick with what we're comfortable with. If you run lab experiments, well, then, run another experiment. If you do surveys, run another survey. And, we're not unlike, medical doctors in that way. If you go to surgeon, you're going to get surgery, right? Same kind of thing. And I think, like, for me, the real inspiration to do this came out of, this moment in social science where, really we're warring with each other about, specifying the tiniest causal effect using the most, valid design and, recruiting principles of statistics that are almost, impossible to observe at large scale in the real world, combined with a kind of deep, interpretive tradition where the goal isn't really necessarily to identify general principles, but to explore kind of new possible mechanisms that can inspire, future research. And in this way, I think the best kind of social science goes through cycles of deductive and inductive reasoning. We test theories, but we also need to generate theories. Otherwise, we wind up with this kind of, well-known spotlight problem, right? It's like as if everything's dark and a spotlight illuminates one part of the world, and that's what we study predictably, right? So for me, the qualitative work really was an attempt to say, okay, here we have a somewhat unexpected finding. And to be frank, we didn't know what was driving it. On the one hand, we had all this data. We had millions of tweets and, could track, people's networks as they're unfolding over time. We had surveyed them at multiple points in time. We had looked for patterns in the language that they were exposed to in our experiments. When we paid these Republicans to follow a Democratic Twitter bot and Democrats to follow a Republican bot. And we looked at the data every which way using, the fanciest techniques in machine learning. And really there was no smoking gun. And so I thought, well, I don't know what it was like for these people to step outside their echo chamber. And I don't even know who these people are, why don't we go talk to them? The thought of it, right? And it's kind of a strange thing to do a qualitative field experiment, which is ultimately what we did, where really it's a mix of, you're actually trying to randomize people in real life. So in this case, we once again paid Republicans and Democrats to follow a bot that we created that exposed them to politicians, journalists, and media organizations from the other side. But we're also getting to know them before, during, and after, both online and off, through kind of much more in-depth analysis of their social media behavior, but also getting to know, where they grew up, what they think of Trump, what are their thoughts on climate change, what did they do the last time they logged into social media. These are the kind of data that we just don't have when we look at patterns from 30,000 feet using the tools of computational social science.
So how many of those interviews did you do? I forget sort of the scope of the qualitative part of things.
It's about 154 total.
Okay. And is there
multiple interviews?
I hadn't thought of it as a qualitative field experiment. Is there any real precedent for that? Like, are there examples that come to mind of like other people who have done similar things?
I mean, the one I love is Betsy Pollock, who's a social psychologist at Princeton, who did a very famous study of television messaging and ethnic reconciliation in sub-Saharan Africa, where she was kind of embedded into communities that either were exposed to this TV messaging and were not. So that was certainly an inspiration for me. I think part of the problem is we don't have a lot of people who have training in both fields. Often, the people in the qualitative end of the spectrum really are very critical of experimental methods and think that, again, they're estimating tiny effects among tiny parts of the world. And, conversely, the people with the experimental skills, don't really, maybe they're not comfortable talking to people. That could be part of it. But also they think, well, that's a small n, right? That's a small sample size. I can't make anything of that. So, really, I think the most interesting questions are in between. And, we need more people to try to find that middle range spot, which is another thing that sociology, I think, kind of somewhat uniquely contributes.
It's reminding me, I recently talked to Robert Cialdini for this podcast, and he has this notion in social psychology of what he calls the full cycle approach to social psychology, where you look to the world to get your questions, you bring them into the lab to take them apart, and then you go back out into the world to make sure you still understand what's going on. Yeah, and there's part of this that feels like it's doing all of that in some ways simultaneously, where you're sort of just exploring qualitatively while you're manipulating variables, while you're measuring stuff quantitatively. And at the end, presumably, you get a fuller, more accurate, real picture of what's happening.
Yeah, it's really messy. For example, in our qualitative field experiment, one of the things that shocked me was one particular individual, his attitudes on race just completely flip-flopped. He had, fairly, negative views about African Americans. Then, within a few months, he had all these positive views of African Americans. I was like, what was he seeing? What did the bot retweet? Is desperately using the survey data to try to figure it out. And it turns out, he started a romantic relationship with an African American woman. Right? There's a data point that you just don't see, right? If you don't, get to know people and get to fill in these blanks. There's many other examples, that make the research messy. And then in the end, you really realize, you sacrifice, breadth for depth, and you really want to understand. You have to care about those idiosyncratic details in a person's life to understand exactly how they're experiencing your treatment. Maybe in that case, it made this particular guy more receptive to the racial appeals that the bot was making than the next person.
Are there, I was kind of wondering, at a few points, I think you mentioned moments of surprise or having learned yourself from these interviews. Are there things about U.S. public opinion that you ignored, took for granted, didn't appreciate until looking at what people actually said when doing these interviews?
Yeah, I think, one thing that so many of us are guilty of in the ivory tower is to just assume that everybody shares our perspective on the world, especially in the realm of politics. If there's one thing we know from survey research, it's that most people avoid politics at all costs, and I certainly knew that and was familiar with that research. But I think really understanding how, for a lot of the people we met, sports, video games, TV shows have a lot more centrality to their, view of the world and what they care about than, what Mitt Romney said or, what Hillary Clinton said. And in fact, they're often avoiding politics. So one of the women that I profile in the book is a pretty interesting woman who I call Patty. And she's an unenthusiastic Democrat. She really she doesn't really like either party, but if you ask her, who do you vote for? She says, well, I usually vote for Democrats, when I vote. So she's not, the type of person who we kind of idealize in social science, which is this like rational creature who's capable of expressing a political opinion on any topic at any time, right? She's like most people. Like she just, she doesn't care much for politics. She gets frustrated when politics comes up on TV. She thinks that, both sides are unreasonable. And interestingly, even though she's a Democrat, she had some kind of conservative leaning views. So, she was mildly anti-immigrant. She thought she was worried immigrants were, really destroying American culture and taking away American jobs. She was kind of concerned about government overregulation of the economy and taxation. In a lot of ways, she seemed like the type of person which journalistic accounts have profiled, the type of person who would be sympathetic to a Trump-style populism, to someone who, really could really be turned. And so when we began to kind of turn up the dial of exposing her to more and more Republicans, I was really curious, is this person going to kind of buck the trend? And maybe I finally found the person who will respond to this stuff. And, what we saw was exactly what we saw in the quantitative experiment. So instead of, say, calmly considering the alternate ideas of a David Brooks, a center-right figure, and maybe moderating her views on liberal issues, she tuned right into the most extreme parts of the continuum. So, folks like Ted Cruz, owning the libs and so on and so forth. All this kind of, in other words, she gets exposed to partisan warfare by stepping outside of her echo chamber. And somewhat paradoxically, this then makes her feel like she has to choose sides. So again, not, engaging in a competition of ideas, but a competition of identities. And really what we saw is this identity priming effect that came to inform a lot of the rest of the book and a lot of the rest of the research.
Yeah, there's a way that you frame it, that realizing there's a war out there, and not only that, but like I'm in it. Like I didn't realize that I'm part of this battle, so like I better gear up and get ready to get in there.
Exactly.
One of the pieces of research recently that's really kind of reshaped the way I think about these things goes to what you're saying, and you said it in the book too, which is, as someone who reads political psychology, who's at least somewhat interested in how politics unfolds, it feels like, oh yeah, everyone has their side, everyone knows what they're doing. But the public opinion data that show like huge amounts of the public either don't choose liberal or conservative when offered the option, or they say, I don't know, or I'm right in the middle. Mm-hmm. You go, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Based on everything that looks like, oh, there's this like huge war that's a brewing with all these extreme views.
Right.
And so I kind of, that transitions a little bit into the metaphor that you use throughout, which is what social media is. So you refer to it as a prism, which is sort of a contrast to this notion of just a pure, simple mirror that reflects out. And so that contrast is grounded in this notion of looking glass self, which is a classic sociology idea. So I wondered if you could sort of give us a little glimpse into what looking glass self is, sort of just as a concept.
Sure.
And how social media is or isn't that.
Sure. I think what makes us unique as humans is our tendency to cultivate identities and to care so much about what other people think about us. I mean, if nothing else is distinctively human, I think that's probably it, right? And, this concept of the looking glass self comes around the turn of the 20th century. And basically the idea is as follows, each day we kind of wake up, we knowingly or unknowingly, we're presenting different versions of ourselves. We're kind of, today I'm in professor mode, tomorrow I'm in, uncle mode, whatever it is, right? We kind of enact these roles. But then importantly, we're constantly scanning our social environment for evidence of which ones of these identities are kind of working, which ones make other people like us and which ones give us a sense of social status. And then we tend to cultivate, again, knowingly or unknowingly, those identities that, make us fit in and make us feel good about ourselves. The great tragedy of human nature, especially from a sociological perspective, is that we're terrible at doing this, right? We constantly misread the reactions of others. We cultivate identities that aren't necessarily the ones that would give us the most status. And but the key question is misreading the social environment. How does that happen? And that's where I came up with the metaphor of the social media prism. We might like to use social media as a mirror. And again, like we were just talking about, everybody's so extreme out there. How can everybody be, not picking a side, right? It's because, those of us who spend time on Twitter are seeing a profoundly distorted, segment of the or portrait of the American population. We know that 73% of posts about politics are created by just 6% of Twitter users. And those 6% of Twitter users have pretty extreme views. So the net effect is that we all think that, things are much more polarized than they really are. So when we think about the looking glass self and our tendency to cultivate identities, and this is where the sociology comes in. This is where understanding how social relationships shape this identity cultivation process. We really need to think about how the structure of our platforms changes this all too human process. And I think it does so in two ways. The first is that it gives us unprecedented flexibility to try out different identities. Some platforms let us be completely anonymous. Others at least allow us to give selective accounts, of what's going on in our lives. And then second, we have these much more efficient means for monitoring our social environment: likes, follows, also comments, terms like getting ratioed, right? We have all these new metrics that kind of help us figure out whether we're, whether our presentation of self is working. Now, of course, those metrics, aren't the perfect, measure of what most people would think of us. Rather, they're measures of what very active people on social media think of us. But we tend to normalize that, and we tend to misunderstand it as evidence that, whatever presentation of self we're using, to borrow the phrase of the, legendary sociologist Irving Goffman, we tend to cultivate that identity. And unfortunately, that has far-reaching consequences that encourage extremism and make moderates seem invisible, I think.
So, you talk, this sort of struck me at the beginning of the pandemic, which then I saw you would come to that at the end of the book, which is, I was so struck by the difference between the polling that showed that this wasn't a partisan issue. Everyone was like, oh my God, this is awful. Right. We got to buckle down and do something.
Exactly.
And yet you go, oh, but it just looks like there's this partisan issue. Mm-hmm. The tricky thing that I am trying to grapple with is that was a case where eventually the world caught up with the social media distortion. Mm-hmm. And so is there a sense that is what happens, that people do end up shaping their own views based on these extremists, versus I think you kind of talk a little bit about how people might retreat and go, I don't want to get caught in the middle of this. Right. I'm just going to get thrown under the bus for even expressing an opinion.
Right. So how much we care about this social media feedback, and, for social psychologists, you might call this social learning. You can think of it as a giant Skinner machine, where we perform this thing. And if we get, the pellet of food, then we do it again. Right. But we have to ask about the motivation. Right. So what types of people would care about gaining status on social media? And the answer, our research indicates, is people who lack social status in their offline lives. So the story that's most vivid in my mind from all the many, many people we met is a guy that I call Ray. And, Ray is an interesting individual. When you first meet him, he's very polite, even deferential. He goes out of his way to say, criticize incivility online. He says he's a moderate conservative, but he says mostly avoids politics, Then we go to look at him online, especially on Twitter. And I was shocked to discover that this is basically the most prolific political troll I've ever seen in a decade of doing this stuff, right? So who is this guy? And, unspeakable, vile stuff that he's saying about, Obama and other leading Democrats. And, when we go back to try to make sense of him, especially, and this is where the triangulation of multiple data sources becomes useful. Our survey firm can give us data on his demographics, his location. We're able to, discover that he's actually a middle-aged man who lives with his mom in a city that's mostly liberal, in a profession that's mostly liberal. And so, like, he's an outcast. This is a social media for him as a kind of refuge where he's gaining something that he can't get in his offline life. And so, of course, the kind of micro celebrity he's able to achieve online isn't very meaningful. Like, the people liking his posts are not having him over for dinner or asking for his autograph or anything like that. Right. But, it fulfills for him, I think, a kind of psychic need for status that we all need. So what I'm not saying is that all of us have the potential to do this kind of Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde style transformation that we see in this guy, Ray. The important question is, where do you get your sense of status from? And for a lot of us, it's not social media. And to the contrary, talking about politics on social media is more of a liability. It can complicate the hard fought status we've earned in our life, in our career, or in our family, or friendships, or other kinds of personal relationships. And so the other thing I do in the book is profile a lot of moderates and try to, as you say, explain why they really disengage. And of course, the consequence for all of us is that we've come to misunderstand these extremists like Ray as kind of representative of moderate people on the other side, when the moderate people have just largely, gone dark.
So your description of being able to know this guy so well did make me think, despite all the value of doing this kind of work, are there like ethical trade-offs? Have you gotten any pushback on, like, is this a little invasive that you can sort of stitch together this guy's online and offline life in a way that we can sort of make guesses about why he's doing what he's doing?
Sure. There are absolutely ethical issues in this new field, computational social science. And I think we've seen largely unethical experiments that were done without people's consent, especially on social media platforms like Facebook. But one of the unique parts about, the researchers leading the effort rather than the platforms leading the effort is we are all beholden to ethical standards, by institutional review boards. Now, these aren't perfect. They have to evolve to meet these changing threats to people's, confidentiality. But, we at the very least can ask for permission to do all of these things. So, people who participated in these studies were told that we were going to have access to all of their data. So, so we could still, I think, rightly ask questions about privacy. But at the very least, I think informed consent is something that is a really important, whenever possible, and almost always should be collected by researchers. And so there are ethical issues here. A lot of them are complex too, because especially once we start to do experiments that extend beyond the lab, that extend to real people in real life, you can't control people like you might like to in a lab. You can't control them, for example, talking to each other. And this creates a lot of challenges, not only for ethics, but also for analysis of the data. So we, for example, saw people ganging up on the bot, and really egging each other on. So like actually observing peer effects, so to speak, in the wild. So there are ethical issues. We're really, I always tell my students, it's not just about satisfying the lawyers at your university and institutional review board. It's really thinking about unknown unknowns. And, in a lot of cases, we've had to share less than we might like, which is why we go to great lengths in the book to, change details of people's professions and names and geographical locations and things of that nature to further protect their confidentiality.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the prior work that you'd done. So you reference a few times work that you've done on, I think it's anti-Muslim bias and how it sort of emerged, which is not something I'm super familiar with. So maybe you could give a background and also the ways in which it might have leaked into how you think about the polarization on social media.
Yeah. So my first book is called Terrified: How Anti-Muslim Fringe Organizations Became Mainstream. And really more broadly, I'm not an expert in Islam. I'm an expert in how ideas compete for legitimacy in the public sphere. And that's really what I wanted to do with that book, is develop a theory of why certain ideas come to dominate public discourse. And this was, again, during the early ages of computational social science. And I recognized that there was a potential to use algorithms to track this spread of text across the public sphere. So basically what I did is amassed a large sample of press releases that were kind of competing to define Muslims. Are Muslims, a peaceful religion, or are they, secretly, harboring, are they an enemy within, right? Which was, there are many competing narratives about what Muslim, or maybe some Muslims are good and other Muslims are bad, right? But so I didn't have a horse in the race for which one of these ideas was right. I just wanted to see which one competes and how. And so I recognized that by comparing these press releases to hundreds of thousands of newspaper articles, television transcripts, and other kinds of texts, I could discover, which ones of these narratives is picking up, getting kind of selected, and wound up articulating kind of an evolutionary theory that explains how fringe ideas become mainstream. In through a process in which there's a kind of selection, an evolutionary selection of fringe, particularly emotional fringe ideas. And that book also used this kind of mixed method approach where, I was seeing these patterns in the data of, how these once fringe ideas were becoming mainstream, but also talking about the people who were actually enabling these transformations, the social networks that were enabling these transformations, the fundraising networks that were enabling these transformations. And so that was very much an attempt to explain how extremism becomes normalized. And certainly on social media, we see that, left and right these days.
So the value of the press release is that these are organizations who are kind of spitting out possible stories, and it's up to individual media outlets whether they're going to pick it up, right? That's why it's sort of which of these narratives is getting seized upon.
Exactly. And, we don't think a lot about ideas that die. We tend to focus on the ideas that survive. And those, of course, are, in the minority, And so when we try to do a epidemiology of ideas, we are often left with, the lone surviving idea, right? And then we tend to generalize characteristics of that idea to, a broader theory. So, for example, why did Occupy Wall Street become so successful? Well, 99% was a great slogan or something like that, right? But there were any number of other competing ideas about social inequality at the time, right? And that's in the end a pretty impoverished way of explaining why some ideas survive when most ideas die. And so the cool thing about this type of plagiarism detection strategy that I used, I think, is that you're able to, explain why most ideas die and why only a small minority survive, and then the consequences of that survival for the evolution of public discourse, thereafter.
It reminds me, we relatively recently did the grad student selection process where you're often in that same boat where you go, all we have access to is information about students who already made the cut first, right?
Exactly.
And then we can come up with all these theories about what it takes to be a successful grad student. Exactly. But we're missing information about all the students who didn't make that cut for whatever legitimate or illegitimate reason. So it sounds a little bit like that, but sort of at this global scale.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So in what ways do you see parallels between what you discovered through those kinds of analyses and what you see just on general political rhetoric on social media?
Well, I think, one thing that was happening as I was doing that analysis was social media was really coming into its own. So in that book, I tried in one of the, penultimate chapter, I think it was, to, see, well, what does social media mean for all this, because back then, this is, the aftermath of September 11th, you still have media gatekeepers. You still have people whose job it is to decide what should count as news. And, these people have enormous influence over the evolution of public debate. And one thing that is so obviously shifted is, sure, if the New York Times retweets something a lot more, Fox News retweets something, a lot more people are going to pay attention. But there's also the potential for, virtually anyone to go viral and virtually anyone to start a far-ranging debate. And I think that is where we've seen, this power of social media and the design of our platforms to create these kind of somewhat perverse incentive structures for status seeking. Really, we're optimized for status seeking, which is not the same as being optimized for democracy, much less, democratic deliberation. So for me, that's the biggest change. And really and there's good parts of that change too, right? Democratization of debate is probably a good thing. But it also means that there's, much less control and that has obvious consequences for the evolution of our public conversations.
That's a better transition than I anticipated for the last thing I was going to ask about, which is
okay, cool.
The Discuss It website,
right.
Or app. And so as though bots online and big data and qualitative interviews weren't enough, your lab thought, let's make our own social
Yeah.
media platform.
Yeah, we are gluttons for punishment, I guess. Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
just even as a thing to do, I'm curious, like, did that, like, where did that spring from? How did it actually get pulled off?
Yeah.
And then also, what is it and why might it be valuable?
Right. So, I mean, here's the big problem I think we face in this research space is we need to ask fundamental questions about how the design of social media platforms are shaping social relationships. Like things like the algorithms inside the guts of the platform, the publicness of the platform, how people are brought into conversation with each other, how they find each other. And all of these things are completely off limits if we go to the platforms and say, hey, Facebook, I'd like to make, 300 users anonymous today. Could you help me out? Right. That's a quick and pretty easy no on their part for a lot of different reasons, right? Some of them reasonable. They can't compromise their user experience. They don't want to deal with the PR issues. They don't want to deal with the legal issues, possible ethical issues. It's just too much risk for them. But on the other hand, we've been content to allow Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, other platforms to evolve in this largely ad hoc and chaotic manner. And nobody's asking the question, if we could redesign social media from scratch, how would we do it? And so we decided that if we wanted to ask these fundamental questions about how we should reform social media, we would have to create our own platform, pay people to use it, and then we would have full control over all the features of the platform and try to identify which ones might be polarizing and which ones might be less polarizing. And so our hope in this effort is that we've created a space that not only our group but other researchers can run all sorts of field experiments that really simulate a real social media platform. So we offered a large group of people money to complete a long survey about their views, and then a day or two later they received a seemingly unrelated invitation, seemed to be coming from another group of researchers that basically invited them to test a new social media platform. And so, we didn't give them any incentive to use the platform in one way or the other. We simply gave them an invite code, which, unbeknownst to them, paired them with a member of the other party to engage in an anonymous conversation about either immigration or gun control. And we wanted to study anonymity because there's this interesting puzzle with anonymity. On the one hand, anonymity enables that guy, Ray, the Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde guy who hides behind anonymity and says things on social media they'll never say in real life. And so there's an obvious danger of anonymity. It can lead to some of the worst, human behavior. We've all heard, like, don't read the comments, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's because the comments are usually anonymous. On the other hand, if identity is really spearheading our experience on social media and is such a key motivation of how we use social media, then anonymity also has this feature, which is allowing us to take identity out of the equation. And if we do that, the thinking was perhaps people would be able to focus more on the content of each other's ideas rather than the identity, like the us them dynamic that we see so clearly on most platforms. And so what we did is we compared people who used the anonymous app to people who didn't. And we were pretty surprised to see that people who used the app depolarized a lot. And perhaps even more surprisingly, Republicans depolarized at about twice the rate of Democrats, suggesting, I think, that some of what we're seeing is, the result of peer pressure. Republicans may feel, because of the orthodoxy and the strong, ideology attached to their side, it's really hard to explore, unpopular ideas in the context of a very public social media space like, Twitter or maybe even Facebook. And so, this suggests that, maybe one of the solutions is to create some spaces. I'm certainly not saying that we need to make Facebook anonymous or Twitter anonymous, but that there could be a new kind of social media site that enables anonymous conversation and perhaps incentivizes people to convince each other across party lines, creating a new kind of status, right? We can't really, the funny thing about identity, I think, is you can't tell people, stop being extreme, right? That has the opposite effect. But what you can do is try to create new types of identities and new forms of status, and then kind of nudge people to try to pursue them. And so I think a structure like this would be really interesting for that small part of the population that actually wants to talk about politics. Obviously, there's a huge part that would not have any interest in talking about politics anonymously online, but that's always been the case. So why not allow political conversations to splinter onto a new platform, much like we've allowed our hobbies to go to Pinterest or our videos to go to TikTok or whatever it is.
Did the app look good? I always think about when psychologists design video games to test.
Yeah.
You go, no one would voluntarily choose.
We spent a lot of time, working with a professional graphic designer and a lot of UX or user experience people to try to make it user friendly. I think in the end, it succeeded. It simulated like a reasonable upstart social media company. We even had to staff a user support line for a week, which was fun. But these things, this final issue of translating, science into public tools is a real challenge. And for this case, we were really just trying to run a research study. But the other mission of the Polarization Lab is to create that I co-direct is to create public tools that anyone can use to kind of try to attack polarization from the bottom up. So for example, we have tools that allow people to identify and avoid extremists and boost moderation so that we can all kind of become aware of this tendency for false polarization to occur, for us to overestimate the extremity of the other side and lose sight of moderation. We have bots that retweet people on a bipartisanship leaderboard. We have other tools that allow you to, for example, estimate what your politics look like to other people based upon the content of your tweets, things like that. Because, at the end of the day, even though these top-down solutions would be great, like, Facebook and Twitter aren't going anywhere, right? And so, yes, there's things that Facebook and Twitter could do. For example, they could, optimize or boost posts that appeal to people across social divides instead of, kind of preaching to the choir, which is what we're seeing right now. But, at the end of the day, it's going to be up to us, social media users. We are the supply side of this problem, and at present, I think an underappreciated amount of polarization is coming from us. And so in trying to encourage a more thoughtful, introspective social media user, but also give them tools that allow them to enact and make, non-polarizing habits into, core parts of their daily experience on social media is I think where we need to go.
Nice. Well, I will keep my fingers crossed that we save ourselves from full collapse. And we make social media a pleasant place to be. I just want to say thanks so much for taking the time to talk about this. This was really fun.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah.